This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lo Kwei-Su. Tonight, South Korea in turmoil. 6 opposition parties file an impeachment bill against the president after Yoon Suk Yeol triggered a political crisis, declaring martial law before walking that back just hours later. That shock move prompting concern from other governments and rallies in the capital, with the country's largest union vowing to strike until the president resigns. The political storm in Asia's 4th largest economy, sending shivers through trading floors in Seoul, stocks sinking and the won tumbling before rebounding on Yoon's U-turn, and the central bank sending reassurance to the markets. For some Koreans, even a short-lived martial law order brought back frightening memories. The last time South Korea faced this kind of decree was more than 40 years ago. Don't miss our look back later on East Asia Tonight. It lasted just 6 hours, but the failed attempt by South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol to impose martial law has plunged the country into uncertainty after dramatic scenes of soldiers attempting to enter parliament. During a vote to annul the presidential decree, the opposition has one message to Mr. Yoon: resign or be impeached. 6 opposition parties have submitted a bill to impeach him, with a vote to happen within 72 hours. They also want to file insurrection charges.
비상계엄 선포는 절차와 내용 모두 헌법 위반, 법률 위반으로 탄핵 사유다. 무장 군인과 경찰, 국회의원들의 국회 출입을 막고 난입함으로써 국헌문란의 네 번째를
Mr. Yoon's office has denied those accusations. It's released a statement defending the martial law as within the constitutional framework. It added the announcement was timed to minimize damage to the national economy as well as people's lives. Presidential officials also refuting claims that lawmakers' access to parliament had been blocked. In response, Parliament has released footage of military forces arriving at the National Assembly overnight. Parliament has now imposed a ban on all military and police, preventing them from entering the building.
어제와 오늘 윤석열 대통령의 비상계엄 선포로 인해 국회의사당에서 발생한 위헌, 위법적인 행위와 이로 인한 물리적인 피해와 손실에 대해 국회의 안전과 질서를 책임지는 국회 사무총장으로서 강력한 항의의 뜻을 표합니다.
The announcement also stunning investors, the Kospi index ending down more than 1%, 1.44, having shed as much as 2.3% at the open. The one notching a fresh two-year low, against the greenback as traders fretted over the possible impact. It cut losses after President Yoon reversed course, but the prospect of his impeachment is expected to create more political instability, with experts saying that could further dampen investor sentiment. South Korean authorities rushing to allay those concerns and reassure the markets. The Bank of Korea has promised to provide, quote, sufficient liquidity to markets to minimize the impact of political turmoil. South Korea's financial regulator adding it stands ready to deploy $7 billion held in a stabilization fund. This is to steady the markets at any time. Joining us for more updates is CNA's Lim Yoon-suk at the Gwanghwamun Square in Seoul, where hundreds of people clearly have gathered. Yoon-suk, it's not just the opposition lawmakers who are up in arms. Trade unions as well. You're at the rally called by South Korea's largest trade union.
Well, yes, I am here at Kwangmun Plaza in downtown Seoul, and this is a rally, a gathering that has been called for by the militant union group, the largest here in South Korea, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. But this rally started about 1 hour ago, but as I was coming to this rally, I did see citizens here too who just said, one of them was telling me that he felt that he had to come here and take part in this rally because he couldn't just go home and sit and not do anything over what had happened overnight. Now, many of these rallies here, protesters here are holding different kinds of placards. What I have with me now says that Yoon Suk Yeol should leave the office for treason, for rebellion, and some of the placards that many of the people here are holding right now says also that President Yoon Suk Yeol should be arrested. Now, although this is a rally that had been called for by the trade union, there are citizens here, and I've also seen people who are here with their children. And so it feels like this is not just a union rally here in South Korea, but also by the citizens. And the KCTU is the largest, but it has about 1 million members here in South Korea, and it has called for an indefinite strike here among all of its members. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody will be going on strike as of tomorrow, but it does mean that the unions will individually now decide on when they will launch a strike, and that will be decided in the coming days. Now, right now, there are the railway workers here in South Korea, across South Korea, are planning to go on strike starting Thursday, and also the subway workers here in the capital Seoul have declared to go on strike starting Friday. Also, non-regular workers here from daycare centers who take care of children or the elderly, or people who take care of the canteens in different schools across the country have also vowed to go ahead with a scheduled strike starting Friday. And so this is a rally, which is really just starting today, but it feels like many here are saying that they will be coming out here every night as long as this rally continues. And the KCTU says that this rally will continue as long as President Yoon Suk Yeol remains in office, and they will do so until he leaves the presidential office.
Of course, as public pressure builds at rallies such as you are showing right now, it's building as well in terms of pressure from impeachment. Of course, that bill submitted just a few hours ago, and we're told we have 72 hours from that submission until a vote can be carried in the National Assembly. What happens now, Mr. Yoon?
Well, yes, that is the big question. Now it's this whole process of impeachment. The main opposition Democratic Party did say early this morning that President Yoon Suk Yeol had until today to resign, to leave the office. But because he did not, the Democratic Party decided to go ahead with that motion. Now, this will have to be passed in Parliament. And it means that they need about 200 members, 2/3 of the 300-member Parliament, to support this bill. And if they do get that support, then yes, they can go ahead and impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol. But right now, the main opposition party, together with other small opposition parties, have about 192 votes, which means that they will need more votes from the ruling party. But if you remember, some of the ruling party lawmakers did vote to overturn this martial law when the National Assembly took that vote early this morning, a few hours after President Yoon Suk Yeol imposed that martial law. And so the main opposition Democratic Party members have said that they're hoping that the ruling party members will join them and impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol because he doesn't have the mandate of the people. The South Koreans have no idea what forced him or what got him to impose that martial law. And the main opposition party and also the ruling party head Han Dong-un has said that President Yoon Suk Yeol has to come out, address the people, and give an explanation as to what happened last night and why he had to take those measures. And so we'll have to wait and see. But even after the bill is passed by the National Assembly, if it is passed, then they also have to go through the Constitutional Court. And it's a 9-member Constitutional Court, but right now they're only 6 justices because the others have retired. And so for them to be able to get the Constitutional Court to also support this and give the approval, the first thing that the parliament members will have to do is to appoint the justices inside the Constitutional Court. And so experts are saying, it's very possible that, yes, the motion has been passed, has been put to Parliament, and the main opposition party is saying that they could take a vote as early as Friday or over the weekend. But after that, they will have to go through some process, some procedures before they can finally go ahead, and if they do get all their support, and to go ahead and impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol. But right now, President Yoon Suk Yeol has not made any kind of public address to the nation. He hasn't come forward since he lifted that martial law here in South Korea. But we do have the defense minister who is under pressure by the opposition party and also the ruling party to step down. Just a few minutes ago, we got word that the defense minister has tendered in his resignation. He has apologized for this, saying that he is responsible for everything that has happened. And he said that all the actions that the officers, the military soldiers took last night was because they were under the order of the minister, and he takes full responsibility for this. But we still haven't heard anything from President Yoon Suk Yeol, and I think the people here want to hear what happened last night and why President Yoon Suk Yeol had to impose martial law here in South Korea.
All right, so South Korea's defense minister already tendering his resignation. CNN's Lim Yun-suk there in Seoul. And for more insights into this turmoil, we're now joined by Professor Mason Ritchie. He's an associate professor of international policy at the Hankook University of Foreign Studies. Professor Ritchie, we just heard from our correspondent there. The defense minister has tendered his resignation. He has said he's taking responsibility for all that has gone wrong the last day or so. If he resigns, does it mean the president and the rest of the cabinet does not also need to resign to take responsibility?
Well, I mean, I think clearly the president is under enormous pressure to resign, not only from the opposition party, that would be totally normal, but I think even within his own party, which is, however, split. I think that there are some members of the party who are trying to find some way to bring this to a resolution through his resignation, and others perhaps who are willing to take a gamble on what happens in an impeachment process. And then there's the question of the rest of the cabinet. And that I think we don't have an answer to, in part because it's a little bit unclear now what the cabinet knew and which members knew and what they knew before this martial law was decreed yesterday evening. And so I think until that gets fully settled, we're not going to be entirely sure what the responsibility is of the cabinet, other than, of course, the defense minister who has tendered his resignation and apologized and has now had articles of impeachment filed against him also. And right now those are still valid because he has not yet had his resignation accepted by the president. So until that's accepted, he's actually still in his position. And then, we don't know which of the other cabinet ministers knew what. The rumors right now seem to be that, for instance, the foreign minister and the finance minister and the prime minister were against this, but perhaps some other ministers were for it. I'm hearing, for instance, the interior minister may face impeachment articles and may himself also face treason charges, which are also perhaps being teed up against both the president and the defense minister.
Professor Ritchie, I realize this is speculative, but if the party wants to survive, and if, as you suggest, there were other quarters that were not in favor of imposing martial law, do they have any leverage to exercise on the president so that he resigns and therefore allows the party to deflect this blame and survive, I suppose, to vote on another day?
Does the party have any leverage? And that's a very complicated question because among other things, the party right now isn't united, right? There are some people who, within the party, who are already looking ahead to the next election, and for president, which is almost certain to happen, at some point within the next several months, regardless of whether or not Yoon steps down because he resigns or if he is impeached. So their leverage, I think, is going to be isolating him and essentially trying to balance the responsibility on him as, effectively speaking, the head of the party, although he's not technically the head of the party. That's Han Dong-hoon. But as president, of course, and the most important figure, therefore, politically in Korea, in some sense, symbolically, he's the head of the party. So they're going to want to balance between putting all of the pressure in some sense on him, but of course in some sense symbolizing the failure of the party as a whole, versus spreading some of that responsibility around, which is also normal considering that this was a cabinet, perhaps not cabinet decision, but cabinets in general take responsibility collectively for decisions, even though personally they may disapprove of a measure, and in this case, obviously a very grave one.
But Professor Ritchie, in a way, the only way we can have some insight into how President Yoon might act is to think about why he might have acted to do this in the first instance. Our correspondent is saying that no one in South Korea, they're wondering why he actually acted to impose martial law. This is what we can call an auto golpe. So it was a self-coup, a sitting president seizing more power for himself, often with the assistance of the military. Why do you think, and this is speculation, Mr. Yoon acted to do this in the first instance?
Yeah, so in political science, we have a term for this. We call this the personalization of power, or the personalization of executive power. And in some respect, I think I'm willing to in some way believe his reasoning, that we got in the statement justifying the martial law decree, which is to say he was frustrated about a number of things. One of them is in his estimation, unacceptable way in which the opposition party slimmed down the budget too much and made it difficult in this new budget for the state to carry out some of its functions. The way that the opposition party was attempting over time to impeach some of his senior officials multiple times, and in that sense, gummed up the legislative process in that way. In addition, they were going after his wife and other people in his administration and close to his administration, implicated in various scandals. So I think if you add all of those things together, plus what was looking at perhaps a looming impeachment for himself, I think if you add all of those together, I think that he thought that they reached a level that he considered to be quote unquote anti-state activity, and that was driven, again, in his estimation, and I'm going to be clear, I don't share this, but in his estimation, forces within the opposition party in the National Assembly who are working in some way on behalf of North Korea, perhaps China, and other forces. And so I think, at least in his head, perhaps as paranoid and isolated and as unpopular as he was, that all of these things sort of functioned together to lead him to take this dramatic and ill thought out step.
Professor, final question. It may be in his head, but do you think this might carry the day in terms of persuading lawmakers in Parliament? His reasoning. Final question.
To impeach him, or
to suggest that in fact what he did was within constitutional limits. Final question.
No, I don't think that that's the case. If for no other reason than simply, popularly, in 2024, South Koreans, the general population, aren't going to put up with this. And there's obviously the letter of the law, and that will need to be studied, by legal scholars here. And the letter of the law will need to be compared, precisely with the steps that Yoon took, and whether or not the steps that he took to decreeing martial law, including the state council meeting, as well as informing the National Assembly immediately after the decree of martial law, whether those steps were followed correctly and legally. So essentially a process question. And then there's a second part of the question, which is to what extent was this done in good faith? And I don't think that you can make the argument ultimately that it was done in good faith, just because his head had a distorted view or a diluted view of reality potentially, and therefore he believes some of those things doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good faith action, or it's one that would lead one to believe that the steps that he took were proportional to the concerns that he might have had. Lots of leaders have to deal with difficult opposition and extremely difficult and challenging political circumstances, including isolation and scandal. But the vast majority of them don't turn to martial law and a self-coup in order to personalize power and aggrandize the executive branch.
Thank you. Thanks for sparing us this time on a very busy day. Professor Mason Ritchie, Associate Professor of International Politics at the Hankook University of Foreign Studies. East Asia tonight, going for a short break, but when we return, stay with us, the situation in South Korea, and return to overseas reactions. Amongst them, a postponement of the Swedish Prime Minister's trip to Seoul, which had been due to take place today. And in Tokyo, the Japanese government says it's closely monitoring the situation for potential impacts on bilateral cooperation. Governments around the world are monitoring the situation in South Korea, including authorities here in Singapore. The city-state's embassy in Seoul is urging all Singaporeans in the country to stay calm and monitor the news. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba says Japanese officials are also tracking what's going on.
他国の内政についてあれこれ申し上げる立場にはございません。しかしながら昨晩の戒厳令出以来、私どもとして特段のかつ重大な関心を持って注視をいたしておるところであります。
The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said he welcomes President Yoon's decision to rescind the order in accordance with South Korea's constitution. China also calling for its citizens to enhance safety awareness and to limit unnecessary outings, as well as exercise caution when expressing political opinions. Russia, which had earlier described the situation as concerning, said it hoped the incident would not impact the stability of the Korean peninsula. The short-lived martial law has prompted the postponement of official events. Yonhap, citing diplomatic sources, says Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, who was scheduled to visit South Korea this week for a summit meeting with President Yoon, has delayed his trip. The U.S. has also pushed back tabletop military drills and key nuclear deterrence talks indefinitely. Those events were originally scheduled to take place in Washington this week. And for more, we're joined by CNA's Michio Ishida in Tokyo. Michio, we've heard that reaction, a brief one from Japan's Prime Minister. They're tracking the situation. What else have you heard so far?
Well, this martial law situation is the top news in Japan since this morning, with TV networks here going big. Now, South Korea is a neighbor of Japan, and as Japan and U.S. ally. And slapping martial law was watched with caution, calling speculation here. Something terrible may have happened between South Korea and North Korea, but that seems not to be the case. Well, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is not only monitoring the situation cautiously, but he said emails are being circulated to the Japanese community in South Korea. The Japanese Foreign Ministry says there are over 42,000 Japanese living in South Korea as of 2023. And on the martial law and chaos, Defense Minister Gen Nakatani said he was surprised. He was planning to visit South Korea later this month as the first Japanese defense minister in 9 years. And former Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga was expected to visit South Korea this month too, to set the stage for Mr. Ishiba's visit in early January to celebrate 60 years of ties next year. But local media here say that's been postponed. And as to flights and tours to South Korea, there seems to be no cancellation due to political chaos in South Korea. But some companies, Japanese companies, are switching to working from home and temporarily suspending work trips from Japan to South Korea.
Michio, the very fact that leaders are thinking of celebrating 60 years of ties is a reflection of much warmer ties under President Yoon in South Korea, and also under the US President Joe Biden. With this uncertainty in leadership in South Korea, is there a possible impact on bilateral ties with Japan?
Well, to give you a little bit of background, Japan and South Korea ties were improving and reaching to positive heights since last year. The Japanese government, the local media here, has given credit to President Yoon Suk Yeol. He is liked here in Japan. He acknowledged Japan's apologies and regrets for the colonization of the Korean peninsula. Mr. Yoon formed a foundation in response to Seoul's Supreme Court ruling to monetize Japanese assets in South Korea to compensate forced labor. Now, Japan's position is all wartime-related compensation was handled and resolved based on the 1965 bilateral agreement. Now, on funds set up to compensate comfort women, it came to light South Korean politician embezzled funds for personal use. So Japan responded to Mr. Yoon's positive attitude towards Japan, resuming shuttle diplomacy, and by rebuilding a trilateral partnership together with the U.S. and bilateral relations largely dependent on South Korean president's stance towards Japan. For instance, Mr. Yoon's predecessor, Moon Jae-in, took a harsh stance towards Japan, and so did Ms. Park Geun-hye. But there is concern if Mr. Yoon is impeached, unable to perform his duties, bilateral ties could derail. And with Mr. Donald Trump coming in as U.S. president, analysts here in Japan say it's all the more important Japan-South Korea ties strengthened. But this is uncertain if the circumstance in South Korea will permit.
Well, thanks. CNA's Mitch usually looking at ties ahead, given changes in leadership both in Washington and possibly in Seoul. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, our South Korea coverage continues. The hours-long martial law order brought back frightening memories for some South Koreans. We take a look back in just a moment. Stay with us. You're watching East Asia tonight. South Korea's opposition gives President Yoon Suk Yeol an ultimatum: resign or be impeached. The stern warning follows his failed attempt to impose martial law, which sparked fury across the country. The 155-minute-long martial law caught Seoul's allies and other countries off guard. Sweden's prime minister has postponed a visit, and the U.S. has pushed back a joint military exercise. The market in Seoul taking a hit from the tumultuous events, with both the Kospi and the Kosdaq ending the day firmly in the red. And still ahead on this bulletin, China accusing the Philippines of making, quote, bogus accusations after Manila said the Chinese Coast Guard fired water cannon and sideswiped a government vessel in the South China Sea. President Yoon Suk Yeol's move to impose martial law came as a shock to many in the country, but perhaps no less shocking to others, the speed at which the president then went to give in to his demands and take back his order.
In a span of just 6 hours, South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol made a surprise martial law declaration and then backed down after Parliament voted to overturn it. Mr. Yoon had cited North Korean threats when he declared military rule at 10:30 p.m. local time.
친애하는 국민 여러분, 저는 북한 공산 세력의 위협으로부터 자유 대한민국을 수호하고 우리 국민의 자유와 행복을 약탈하고 있는 파렴치한 종북 반국가 세력들을 일거에 척결하고 자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해 비상계엄을 선포합니다.
Scuffles broke out outside Parliament as protesters tried to block soldiers moving in. Helicopters swirled above while chaos erupted in the National Assembly building. The country last experienced martial law 45 years ago, which bans political activity and censors the media. Opposition lawmakers, though, wanted nothing of it, making it into the chamber that they have majority control of and voting to reject the president's declaration. Their leader had this message for the military.
국군 장병 여러분, 지금부터 대통령의 불법 계엄 선포에 따른 대통령의 명령은 헌법과 법률에 위반한 명백한 불법 명령입니다. 위헌 무효인 불법의 대통령 명령을 따르는 것은 그 자체가 불법입니다.
Soldiers were seen leaving the grounds after the vote, but the military insisted it would maintain martial law until the president lifted it. Mr. Yoon accused lawmakers of reckless activities to paralyze the country.
국회의 계엄 해제 요구가 있어 계엄 사무에 투입된 군을 철수시켰습니다. 바로 국무회의를 통해 국회의 요구를 수용하여 계엄을 해제할 것입니다.
The leader of President Yoon's own ruling party has called this attempt to impose martial law tragic, saying those involved must be held accountable.
President Yoon's decision to enforce martial law could suggest a step backward for the country's democracy. Now, that's according to some observers. The last time a South Korean president made a decree such as this one was back in 1979, when the country was under military dictatorship. Many Koreans still remember lives taken when tanks, armored vehicles, and soldiers plowed through the streets, addressing what officials loosely called anti-state behavior.
어젯밤에 우연히 잠을 자다가 깨서 뉴스를 이제 접하게 됐는데 무척 처음에 들었을 때는 좀 무섭고 당황스러웠고 무슨 일이지? 이게 지금 현재 이 시대 때 일어날 수 있는 일인가? 라는 그런 조금 생각이 많이 들었고 해제될 때까지 잠을 못 잤던 것 같아요. 많이 두려움에 떨어서.
For a closer look at what's happening in South Korea, CNA's Grace Shin, she's done plenty of reporting on politics in Seoul, joins me live in the studio. Now, Grace, we just heard that comment. This is not apparent on screen, but in the rushes, this lady is said to be a 50-year-old resident of Seoul, which would put her at 5 years old when the last time South Korea saw martial law imposed, and at 13 years when the country reached democracy as we understand it. She says she was frightened. Mm-hmm. You are a lot younger than she is. What does this mean for people your age, people older? What do you think? What do you think?
I think regardless of age, though, fear is a validated emotion that a lot of people, regardless of generation, can empathize with, because the martial law has hit us differently from 2024 compared to 1980. But we do share one trauma. It's the fact that at the time, South Korea was in a military dictatorship. And as you mentioned, though I wasn't alive at the time to witness what the military dictatorship was like, I have so many testimonials from my parents' generation or even sometimes grandparents' generation talking about what it was like there. They mentioned the curfew system, how it was, they had to rush back home after school because there would be police riots going on. So they remember a time that's different from mine. And also, thanks to social media and a lot of media content out there, a lot of people from my generation are able to see movies and film content. We even learn it in our history books as to what it took for our predecessors to bring democracy to our country. And at the time, the military decrees were at a much bigger scale. Though what we saw yesterday was only short-lived for 6 hours, if it were to take effect, we would be seeing armed military forces out in the streets like back in the 1980s. So to Koreans, it's something that we fear of.
All right, it was bigger scale in the 80s, but that short-lived martial law imposed yesterday, you were talking about this to me earlier. You said in terms of what the president pinpointed to fall under this law, that has changed with the times, though.
It has. So the law stays the same. Under Article 77 of the Constitution, the president is allowed to give power to the military to help in terms of a state of emergency crisis. Now, that is the same, but yesterday what we saw different in the military decree was, number one, he has asked all national parties, political parties, to refrain from convening together in any type of activities and demonstrations. And number two, it was the callback of medical personnel and trainee doctors to their posts, and that's amid the ongoing months-long medical strike that's going against the government's call to expand the quota for medical schools. Now, you can see that there was modernization in context, and for the first point, I would like to mention that the Special Armed Forces were in front of the National Assembly blocking lawmakers to come into Parliament, and many are speculating that's because the president did not want to be overturned when it comes to his martial law decree. So you can see a modernization there, but I would like to point out one thing didn't change, and that was the loose translation of what a national state of emergency is.
So what is unchanged? I mean, what did you mean by that? Sorry.
If I can elaborate on that, I think even during the military dictatorship, a lot of leaders at the time would use this for political motives. They would say that the country is in a state of emergency. And at the time, given that we were separated with North Korea, they would call anti-state forces communist. And yesterday, during the address televised statement, we saw President Yoon quoting that the state is in paralysis. There's a den of criminals at the National Assembly threatening South Korea's national security, and then he briefly mentioned North Korea. So it's open to interpretation, but the heaviest weight right now is, does political polarity and the fact that Yoon currently being a lame duck with the majority of the National Assembly being opposition bloc members, is that a good foundation for you to say that the state is in a security crisis and a warlike situation that requires a martial law?
You know, we forget very quickly, right?
Yes.
I was in the newsroom when news broke of this, and because there was mention of North Korea, mention of anti-state elements, anti-state forces, the fear right away, given all the news we've had the last few weeks, the last few months of North Korea, involvement in Russian effort in Ukraine, there were concerns that something has happened on North Korean front.
Honestly,
was that a concern for South Koreans, at least in immediate reaction to this news?
Lesu, I have to be honest with you here. I think I was one of them. As a South Korean growing up in a country where we don't realize on a daily basis that war is active because we're not seeing as much active combat compared to other parts of the world, we sometimes become immune to the fact, but we are aware that we're always under a security threat with Pyongyang being our neighbor.
Technically, you're still at war.
We are. And as soon as that news broke out, I received phone calls from my friends in Seoul saying, does this mean that we need to be preparing for war? And because President Yoon mentioned the North Korean threat, but later on he did not specify what the exact threat was, whether there's developing stories on that or whether a security threat was going to happen, people are pointing to the fact that that wasn't the basis for the martial law then.
All right, final question here, Grace. Young as you are, you will not remember past times as I might do. Now, the world has changed. Styles of leadership, those have changed as well. If we look at how South Koreans have reacted to this short-lived imposition of the martial law, what does it say about what South Korea might expect or accept from its leaders? Final question.
That's a great question. I think based on what we've seen over the past few hours, it was a night of confusion, but I do think it was another beacon of democracy for South Korea. If the martial law were enacted and it were to take place, that would have been a backward step for sure. But the fact that the National Assembly was able to stop it and people are now demanding things from the government, whether it be the resignation of the president or holding certain senior officials responsible, we are seeing people become more vocalized about what they want.
And the army didn't join in.
And the army did not join in. I think that's a great step to go. And I feel that South Korea is on its way of resisting any type of authoritarian figure, which is why coercion is no longer the way to go.
Oh, thanks so much for coming in and sharing insights that we don't really get on Newswise. Grace, thanks.
Thank you.
We have extensive coverage on the political crisis in South Korea across CNA platforms. Head to our website, cna.asia, for commentaries on the wide-ranging ramifications of President Yoon's martial law declaration and his reversal, as well as the full text of the military decree he sought to impose. And still ahead on this bulletin, China's Coast Guard accuses the Philippines of making bogus accusations after the latest flare-up in the South China Sea. And we have a roundup of markets in East Asia reacting to South Korea's political crisis with my colleague Roland Lim. An early morning clash between Philippine and Chinese boats in the South China Sea. The Philippine Coast Guard says Chinese boats fired water cannon and side-swiped their vessels. But China is dismissing these as bogus accusations.
Sir, malapit na sila, sir. Collision, sir. Starboard side. Starboard side, sir. Collision.
Looking at video of the movement of collision between Chinese and Philippine vessels. Philippine Coast Guard said their vessels were on patrol near the Scarborough Shoal just after dawn when several Chinese Coast Guard and naval ships came and, quote, took aggressive action. Officials say a Chinese Coast Guard ship fired water cannon and, quote, intentionally sideswiped a Philippine vessel. But China has provided a different account. Beijing's Coast Guard says Philippine ships approached their vessels, quote, dangerously, deliberately collided with a Chinese ship. And Manila is now making what it calls bogus accusations. The Scarborough Shoal, an atoll in the disputed South China Sea, lies west of the Philippine island of Luzon. Manila and Beijing have had several run-ins at sea this year. China claims almost all the South China Sea, and this has angered neighboring countries who have competing claims. The U.S. also wading in, saying China's use of water cannons this morning was, quote, unlawful and put lives at risk. And Roland Lim standing by with much more business news.
Thanks, Vedu. We're going to start off with an analysis on the political crisis in South Korea. Investors have warned it could dent market confidence in a country already exposed to trade tensions. Now, they are keeping a close eye on developments, with analysts pointing out that the upheaval comes as authorities in the region bracing themselves for a second U.S. presidency of Donald Trump, who has vowed to reignite his hardball trade policy. Now, earlier we spoke with Florian Weidinger. He is Chief Investment Officer from Santa Lucia Asset Management. And he told us how the political turmoil impacts the Korean won and what the financial institutions are doing to cope.
It's already the worst performing currency this year. So it's a lot of, let's say, substance has already come out. And the won has been weak, reflecting the sort of relatively poor performance of some Korean companies this year. It's also been under pressure from the Japanese yen. You know, a weak yen always puts pressure on the won being a bit weaker too. But then a stabilizing yen might actually be positive for the won. So the yen stabilizing and drawing a line on 160 is likely going to have a positive read across to the won, even in the face of what's currently going on. And sort of once more, I think it will depend very much on the new political configuration in Korea. I think traders will look very much to what's in the future rather than what happened necessarily yesterday. Well, I think it sadly is a reminder for a lot of investors that there is political risk in several of the markets in our region here. It reminds everyone of what can happen along the way. At the same time, Korean institutions have actually functioned incredibly well given the circumstances. You know, you had the declaration of martial law, you had parliamentarians meeting and successfully voting against in line with the constitution, the cabinet complying with that, the army behaving, and today the central bank meeting and coming out with a reasonable plan that doesn't signal to market participants too much panic. So I think as strange as this move by President Yoon is, and only he knows what he thought with this chess move, actually Korean institutions have functioned quite well in the last 12 hours.
Let's look at the state of the other Asian equity markets in East Asia and see if they're being impacted by South Korea's political crisis. Now, China and Hong Kong stocks, well, they have weakened today, but the investor sentiment is a downbeat owing to a slower services sector growth, as well as escalating trade frictions with the U.S. A private sector survey shows that services was pressured by easing new business growth, including in exports. And that's as the economy braces for a rocky ride with more U.S. tariffs under a second Trump administration. The Caixin S&P Global Services PMI fell to 51.5 from 52.0 in October. but it is still in expansionary mode. Equities, the rest of the region largely steady. Japan's Nikkei 225 eked out gains to end the volatile trading session on a positive note, while Taiwan's benchmark index jumped nearly 1%. Shifting to market sentiment on Asia's chip industry amid escalation of US-China tech rivalry. Now, tech shares ended mixed in Tokyo. The top chip maker, Tokyo Electron, up just slightly above water. And chip-making tool equipment maker, Advantest, is up 0.7% for the day. Meanwhile, though, top investor in the tech sector, SoftBank, is down 1.73%. And that comes after the US imposed fresh restrictions on China's chip sector and Beijing retaliating with its ban on metal exports. 4 of China's top industry associations have called on local firms to be wary of buying US chips. In separate statements released in succession, the association said that US chips are no longer safe and firms should buy locally instead. However, they did not detail why US chips were unsafe or unreliable. Earlier, Beijing blamed or banned exports of rare minerals to the US. And these include critical minerals, gallium, germanium, and antimony used in military applications, solar cells, fiber optic cables, and other manufacturing processes. Now, the move has sparked new concerns that Beijing could next target other critical minerals such as graphite, nickel, and cobalt. Experts say this rising tension could potentially position Australia, a key player in the global critical minerals market, to capitalize on the increased demand. And that's already beginning to reflect in market reaction. Shares of Lynas, that's the world's biggest producer of rare minerals outside of China, well, that ended the session up 5% for the day. And shares of graphite companies in Australia, including Syrah, as well as Renascor, well, that is up 13.6% and 3.3% respectively. China's responses come as the US hit China with new export restrictions on Monday. The latest export ban added 140 companies to an entity list consisting of chip and equipment makers. Now, it's the third crackdown in 3 years on China's semiconductor industry. The two nations have targeted each other's economies in the last few days, escalating tensions even before US President-elect Donald Trump returns to the White House in January. Japanese tech companies could be slapped with hefty fines or be at risk of market exclusion. That's if they fail to fully comply with the EU's upcoming cybersecurity regulations. Now, the EU's Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA, which takes effect this month, is designed to prevent products that fail to meet certain safety requirements from entering the EU market. Now, it mandates that all non-EU companies to get CRA certification in order to sell them to the trade bloc. Now, fines for violations could reach 2.5% of a company's global sales. Full implementation of the act is 3 years away, but for products that take more than 3 years to develop, companies must be compliant already. Japanese tech firms like NEC and Mitsubishi Electric are struggling to keep up with cybersecurity regulations, which call for companies to consider cyber risks from the development stage. Many European companies have teams that specialize in managing software technology and are involved from the design and development stages, making it easier to comply with regulations like the CRA. In Japan, quality assurance departments traditionally handle strict safety checks for hardware. But software checks, well, they are often outsourced. The lack of finalized standards for complying with CRA also slowing Japanese companies.
Well,
and that's it for Business. Wei Su.
Thanks for that, Roland. And this is East Asia Tonight. We'll have more coverage on developments out of South Korea later on Asia Tonight in just an hour's time at 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time.
And don't forget, headlines anytime at CNA.com. Plus, we're on Facebook and YouTube.